Good evening. I'm Dina Mansour, Executive Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana in Missoula, Montana, and welcome to the first of a series of China Dialogues. Tonight's China Dialogue features U.S. Ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns. The Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center was founded by an act of Congress more than 40 years ago to honor the legacy of Mike Mansfield, our longest-serving Senate Majority Leader, as well as our longest-serving U.S. Ambassador to Japan. The Mansfield Center fosters globally minded leaders of integrity in his honor, and we bring to the community a number of programs such as this one tonight. The Mansfield Center is uniquely positioned to address China here in the Rocky Mountain West. Mike Mansfield was considered the expert on Asia, including China, throughout Congress during his tenure, and he also led our nation's first congressional delegation to China in 1972. Here in Montana, we've seen that interest in China encompass a wide range of topics, including military, trade, agriculture, and education. Before I introduce our speaker and moderator, please note that we will share questions from the audience, both questions that were previously submitted, as well as those that you can post in the Q&A box as we speak live tonight. And now I'm honored to introduce tonight's speaker. Nicholas Burns has served as the U.S. Ambassador to the People's Republic of China since March 2022. As ambassador, he leads a team of public servants from 48 U.S. government agencies and sub-agencies at the U.S. mission in China, including at the embassy in Beijing and at American consulates in Shanghai, Guangzhou, Wuhan, and Shenyang. He has had a long career in American diplomacy, serving 6 presidents and 9 secretaries of state, including as State Department spokesperson from 1995 to 1997, ambassador to Greece from 1997 to 2001, ambassador to NATO from 2001 to 2005, and Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 2005 to 2008. After his retirement from the Foreign Service, Ambassador Burns was Goodman Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government from 2008 to 2021, where he founded the school's Future of Diplomacy project. This conversation will be moderated by Joanna Shelton, Vice Chair of the Mansfield Center Advisory Board and former Deputy Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. She also served in the U.S. State Department, U.S. Treasury Department, and on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Now based in Montana, she teaches, lectures, and writes on economic policy issues. Ambassador Burns, we'll start with a statement from you before we go on to bringing Joanna Shelton on to moderate the questions. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Dina, thank you very much, and thank you to Joanna as well, who's a longtime friend of mine. I don't know whether I should say good evening, good morning, or good afternoon. I know we have people on from different countries and different regions, but since you're in Missoula, I'll say good evening to all of you. I'm very pleased to be here. I've been to the University of Montana at Missoula. It's a beautiful school. I'm aware of its strength in Asian studies. And I'm certainly aware of the legacy of Mike Mansfield. When I was a high school, college, and graduate student, he was a giant in the U.S. Senate, but also in American diplomacy. And he really was the expert in our government in so many ways on our policy towards Asia. So I'm really pleased to be with you. I wish I could be in Missoula, which is a great place in a great state, but I'm here in Beijing. And I thought what I might do, Dina and Joanna, is just very briefly frame how we see in our administration the relationship with China, but then leave most of the time to questions and conversation with this diverse audience in 9 countries. And let me say, first of all, we believe that this relationship that the United States has with China is the most consequential of any relationship that we have in the world today. And I think that's certainly true as we look forward. We are the 2 strongest economies in the world. We're the 2 strongest militaries. In many ways, we're the 2 countries with true global reach, and we're very competitive with each other. And I think that is the watchword and the first theme that I'd like to present today. This is a highly competitive relationship. I assume that we're structural competitors and rivals going forward, and that this period of competition between the US and China will continue well into the 2030s, if not beyond. A couple of examples of how we're competing. We're certainly competing in the security realm here in the Indo-Pacific. China is pushing out against friends of ours and allies of ours, against the Philippines. That's Sabina Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, Scarborough Shoal. China doesn't have a leg to stand on in terms of its legal claims in the Spratly and Paracel Islands, and nor does it have a legitimate legal claim to the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea, but it acts as if it does, and therefore it's exceeding international law in what it's doing to contest the sovereignty or the ability of countries to act in their own exclusive economic zones in this whole region of the South and East China Sea. In Taiwan, we see that China is acting, especially since the visit of Speaker Nancy Pelosi a little over 2 years ago, acting in a way that we think is unnecessarily provocative in the Taiwan Strait in terms of its air and naval activities. We think that China should commit itself to a peaceful resolution of its cross-strait differences with the Taiwan authorities. In the Indian border, China is contesting the sovereignty of India in the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, and we're very sympathetic to the Indian side and support India in this rivalry that it has along its own border. So in the security realm, and I haven't even talked about the fact that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is engaged in a dramatic buildup of its forces. There's a buildup in the nuclear weapons forces of China. I think you've seen a reaction out here, a strengthening of America's alliances with Japan, with the Republic of Korea, with the Philippines, with Thailand, and with Australia. The development of AUKUS between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and the development of the Quad, where India, the United States, Japan, and Australia meet. You might have seen just 3 weeks ago, President Biden hosted the Quad leaders at his home in Wilmington, Delaware. The democratic countries of this region obviously want a peaceful relationship with China, but we also want to make sure that we defend the sovereign territory of all of our countries out here. The United States, of course, is a Pacific nation. And so we are acting to secure the peace here and to limit what China can do militarily in this region. That's a primary point of competition between our two countries. Another arena is technology, and I think this is a really interesting one, especially for the students online in this forum. Technology is really center stage in this relationship. We're at a point in global history where we're seeing transformative technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, biotechnology, just to name four, robotics. And there's a healthy commercial competition between Chinese and American and other countries' engineers and research scientists. But many of these technologies will also be militarized. And so we're very conscious of trying to make sure that in a qualitative military and technological sense, that we retain a superiority in military technology as we move in and look into the next decade. That's a primary area of competition. A third is in trade and investment. The irony of our difficulties in trade and investment is that China is the third largest trade partner of the United States after our two border free trade partners, Mexico and Canada. And we have a major relationship, over $650 billion in two-way goods and trades and services last year alone. American companies are here by the thousands, and we want that economic relationship to continue. We do not want to see a decoupling of the two economies. But at the same time, we have to de-risk. And that means that in some critical areas pertaining to our national security with dual-use technologies, we've begun to shut down the flow of those technologies for sale in China. The best example is advanced semiconductors for AI purposes, and we took that action 2 years ago. China's doing the same thing. China is shutting down export of its dual-use technologies to the United States and other countries that are aligned with the United States. So there's a competitive aspect to this big trade and investment relationship. And I must say, just over the last 6 months or so, one of the largest areas of disagreement has been the problem of overcapacity. It's not a new problem. We saw it in the 80s and 90s and the first decade of this century, as Joanna knows very well. She's an economic expert. But right now, the Chinese are doubling down, the PRC government here, doubling down on what it calls the new productive forces, doubling down on production, manufacture of lithium batteries, of electric vehicles, of solar panels, of robotics, of steel, and many other products, and then producing them at 2 to 3 times domestic demand, and then dumping, in economic terms, at artificially low prices, those products in the global market. You've seen a reaction over the last several months. Turkey has raised tariffs against certain Chinese products. South Africa has raised tariffs. Chile, Brazil, Mexico, Canada, and the United States have all raised tariffs. And just last week, the European Union voted to raise tariffs against Chinese electric vehicles in the European market. China's not playing fairly in the international market. And so you see this reaction by countries around the world. In our case, President Biden has imposed 100% tariffs, for instance, on Chinese electric vehicles. So this area of trade and investment is a contested area and a difficult one to manage. Just a final area of competition between us, and it's one that all of you will, I think, as Americans, certainly you'll understand, and it maybe is the most profound area where we disagree with the government of the People's Republic of China, and that's on human rights. We disagree with what is happening in Xinjiang and in Tibet and in Hong Kong. We certainly stand by as a country, and always have, and I hope always will, our First Amendment rights, the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of the press, the freedom of religion, the rule of law, and that is contested between us. We are vocal in speaking out against human rights abuses. We're vocal in speaking out about certain people being held unfairly, including American citizens here in China. So that's another area of competition. I think this level of competition is going to, and this degree of competition is going to remain with us for many years into the future. As we compete, we also want to have a constructive relationship between the two governments when our interests align, and they do align. And so we're working, I think, fairly well together on the issue of climate change. We're the two largest carbon emitters in the world. China, about 28% of all global emissions. The United States, about 10%. And so we've got to work together for the benefit of our own peoples, but also for the world. You all know the Conference of Parties. The 29th session is happening in Baku, in Azerbaijan, just about a month from now. And you'll see the United States and China chairing one of the sessions there. John Podesta, our climate negotiator, was just with us about a month ago. He had a series of productive meetings with the Chinese leadership. And so on climate change, I think there's a way for us to work together and to see that we have to pull on the same oar together, although we differ on issues like nitrous oxide and methane, for instance. On the issue of fentanyl, we're trying to cooperate. And if you're not an American and watching this broadcast, fentanyl is the leading cause of death in the United States of Americans aged 18 to 45. It's a true public health crisis. And the majority of precursor chemicals that make up fentanyl, the synthetic opioid, come from China, not from the government of China, but from illicit black market firms. And so as a result of President Biden's meeting last November with President Xi Jinping, China has agreed to work with the United States, and it has kept that commitment. We've made some progress in trying to slow down the flow of precursor chemicals to the drug cartels, and we want to make much further progress. We need to do more, but I think we have made some progress, and we do have a degree of cooperation with the Chinese. I'd mention a third area of cooperation, and it's nascent. Both of us recognize that artificial intelligence is going to be transformative for all of us as citizens, for governments, and for the global economy. And we've begun a dialogue, we're at the very beginning stages of it, of how we both see the transformational possibilities, both good and bad, both positive and challenging, of AI. And we've begun to have government-to-government meetings on it. There are other areas of cooperation. I just visited the National Cancer Hospital here in Beijing yesterday. I spent 2 hours with surgeons and the hospital president and nurses and health practitioners. Cancer is a crisis here in China, as it is in the United States and in countries all around the world. And I think in terms of global health, there are things we should be doing together to keep our hospitals and our academic institutions and medical schools working together. It wasn't surprising to me, but it was revelatory in some ways that when I met lots and lots of people yesterday, a great number of the physicians, the Chinese physicians who are doing great things to help curb cancer here, were educated in the United States, and they have close ties with American hospitals and research institutions. So we want to work in that basis as well. Final point, Joanna and Dina, and I'll end on this. It goes without saying that we feel in the United States, in our administration, that we've got to make sure that we drive down the probability of conflict with China, and that we seek always to live in peace with China. China is our foremost competitor and adversary in the world, but there is not a scenario where a conflict between us would be in the interest of the United States and China. There's no scenario where that exists. The opposite is true. And so one thing that we've done just in the last 30 to 40 days, we've made some progress in putting some of our senior military commanders together. Admiral Sam Paparo, who runs Indo-PACOM, Indo-Pacific Command in Honolulu, our senior military officer in all of the Indo-Pacific region, has had 2 meetings with the Southern Theater Commander of the People's Liberation Army. We hadn't had such meetings in years. The fact that they met, they didn't agree on everything. The fact that they now know who to call in a crisis, that is qualitatively a good thing, because we do want to have in the future, now and in the future, a peaceful relationship between our countries. This is an enormously complicated relationship, both in the government to government basis, and I hope we can talk, Joanna and Dina, about the people to people aspect of this. As we compete with China, it's very important that we have American students studying here. And I have to tell you, we had 15,000 American students here 10 years ago. We may have, I'm not sure how many we have, 800 last year, maybe we're over 1,000 this year. We haven't counted them all, but we're trying to do that right now. We need to keep young people engaged on both sides. We need young students at the University of Montana to think about learning Mandarin, to have an experience here in China as a young person, so that when you're running the world, when you're a professor at the University of Montana, or you're a senator, or you're a NGO head, or you're working in the private sector, or maybe if you're working for the State Department, which I hope some of you will aim to do, you have a sense of this country, which is our strongest competitor in the world, but obviously a country we're going to have to work with. So knowledge of China on the American side, knowledge of Mandarin, a cultural awareness, an awareness of the deep history of this country is absolutely critical, I think, from a national security perspective. And we simply don't have the number of American students here that I think we need to have to be smart about China in the future. So let me end on that note, and happy to engage in a good discussion, Joanna, with you and Dina.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. I have to say you've really anticipated a lot of questions that have come in. I will say, as you mentioned, we have, I think, close to 500 people who have signed up, 9 countries around the world, 27 states. So there's a lot of interest, a lot of students as well here. And we've had a lot of questions. I think what might be helpful, particularly for maybe our younger viewers, but people who haven't followed China that carefully, maybe over time, let's maybe give a little bit of a historical perspective here at the outset. You and I both worked in government when, well, we remember Deng Xiaoping launched these major reforms, economic reforms in China, also political reforms, giving people much more freedom than they had had before. And you saw millions, hundreds of millions of Chinese lifted out of dire poverty. China was moving in that direction when it then applied for the WTO, World Trade Organization membership. They became a member of the WTO in 2001. And I think we all thought that China would continue largely on that path. In fact, in their accession agreement, they pledged that they would continue on a path toward a more market-oriented economy. And I think, too, the record of history had shown that the more countries became kind of a part of the global system, the more they became had a stake in it and became responsible players. And that seems to have changed. I mean, not only seems, it has changed dramatically. I think Xi Jinping came in 2012, and there has been a re-centralization of power, a reversal of reforms. Could you maybe give your perspective on what you think is driving this? Why do you think that after decades of liberalization that brought so much prosperity, China now has turned in a different direction?
Well, that's the $64 trillion question, I think, Joanna. So thank you for asking it. It's the right question to ask. I'd say one thing first. I've been coming to China since 1988, 36 years now, and you have to give credit to the people of China. One of my takeaways from living here over the last 2.5 years is just how energetic, innovative, resourceful the people of China are. They work extremely hard. There's a 996 culture here. The Chinese work 9 a.m., 9 p.m., 6 days a week. Gosh, I'm out on Sundays, and a lot of people working on Sundays, construction projects, road building. They've done a lot to rebuild their own country, and they've had the fastest rise in global economic history. If you date it from, say, the end of the Mao regime in September 1976 to the present day, no country has ever in global history risen as far and as fast. And they've done a lot of this work, obviously, themselves. And if you look at what they've done to combat illiteracy and abject poverty, it's just extraordinary. What they've done to clean up the skies until really almost 10 years ago when I came to Beijing or Shanghai or Chengdu, you could count on a difficult, polluted air and all the associated health problems. In Beijing, where I've been living, my wife and I have been living, the skies are normally blue here, and they've cleaned up the air. So a lot to give credit to the Chinese people. At the same time, as you know, Joanna, and you were part of the group that brought China into the World Trade Organization, they made commitments. And in some respects, have not abided by those commitments. They've, in a sense, the government of China, taken advantage of the fact that they've had this unfettered access to the global trading system, and yet engaged repeatedly over the last several decades in the dumping, the overcapacity, overproduction problem that I mentioned, dumping their excess manufacturing capacity. And that has ended in destroying jobs, manufacturing jobs in Europe, in Latin America, and certainly in North America, in the United States and Canada. We went through the great China shock of the 1990s and the first decade of this century. And a lot of us know hollowed out main streets in our states and cities of businesses that used to exist, but because of unfair competition from China, no longer exist. That's a problem. And so when I talk to American business people, and that's a major focus of my team here and they tell us about intellectual property theft that continues, forced technology transfer, unfair subsidization by not just the central government in Beijing, but by the provincial government. That makes it very difficult for some American manufacturers here in particular to succeed. And we have thousands of American companies literally trying to succeed here. 5,000 American companies in Shanghai alone, the business capital of China. That gives you a sense of the degree of interaction between our two economies. So we're simply asking China to play by the rules, the economic rules, and they largely have not done that. And thus the crisis between us that you've seen in the later Obama years, certainly during the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, where we want to work with China, and yet we're going to stand up and defend our companies. We're going to defend our allies in the Indo-Pacific in terms of the security threat. And we're certainly going to continue to be vocal on a regular basis when we see gross violations of human rights here. So it's a very difficult relationship to manage because from my perspective as the American ambassador here, we need to compete, and yet we also need to engage and maintaining not a 50-50 balance. It's probably a 90-10 balance, 90 being the competitive side, but we have to have some kind of balance. because we have to engage in this relationship. So I think that's probably our most immediate challenge on a day-to-day basis.
Well, and staying on the economic side, I think as you say, China has not lived up to the commitments that it made in many areas. I know that the United States has taken cases to the WTO. WTO takes a long time. Now the WTO, of course, is less active, and therefore now, as you point out, the Biden administration has kept the tariffs in place that the Trump administration put in place initially. We have export restrictions, investment screening on both sides. One question is, how do you strike the right balance here? This is a question that has come up. There are critics on both sides of this. We have one candidate now proposing to put high tariffs on China across the board. But I think whoever wins the election is pretty clear that a tough policy is going to continue. Some people say this is too tough. It hurts American firms in the United States and consumers. We can't get the products. And you think of electric vehicles and solar panels, for example, that are important to climate, meeting our climate goals. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there are others who say, China is just so out of sync with the rules of the global system that we should be even tougher. So do you think there's more we should do? How do we strike a right balance? And do you think we're at about the right balance now?
Thank you. Well, first of all, you mentioned this event that's going to happen in the United States on November 5th. I am subject, as are all of my members of my team here in this very large embassy, to the Hatch Act, an American law that prohibits us from involving ourselves publicly in the campaign. So we stick to that. We don't talk about the campaign here, and nothing I'm about to say is in any way, shape, or form predictive or a comment on our election. So let me just say that first of all. Second, it's another very good question. How should we approach this extraordinarily large and important economic relationship? We've decided, and Janet Yellen, our Secretary of the Treasury, who's been here twice, by the way, most recently in April, she has said that a decoupling of the two economies would be, in her words, disastrous for the American economy, the Chinese economy, and the global economy. And she's right. And so I am actively encouraging, as ambassador here and meeting around this table in this office, American CEOs on a nearly daily basis. And for most of them, saying, we're going to support you to continue to trade and invest in this country. If you're in consumer products, for instance, Procter & Gamble's here with 9 plants, go ahead, continue to work with China. If you're in agriculture, and if you're from an agriculture state or a ranch state, Montana, or a fishery state like my home state of Massachusetts, China's the largest market for American agricultural, ranch, and fisheries exports. It is critical to American farmers, ranchers, and fishing industry. And so we want that to go ahead. When it comes to financial services, American financial institutions now can own 100% of their business. They don't need a joint venture part with China. That's a big breakthrough produced by the President Trump's negotiations back in 2018-19 with the Chinese government. So we want the economic relationship to continue, but we are de-risking. That's a term that Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, floated nearly 2 years ago. And what that means is part of the trade, any part of the trade, exports by the United States to China that might help the Chinese national security position, we're not going to allow that to go forward. There's a civil-military fusion here, Joanna. I think you're familiar with it. Any Chinese company must hand over its manufacturing product, its IP, its knowledge to the People's Liberation Army. That's by law here in China. So we don't want to see advanced semiconductors by our tech companies exported to China any longer. In fact, they're now prohibited for AI purposes because we don't want to strengthen the People's Liberation Army in this long-running competition that we have for peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. We don't want to be outpointed by the PLA in terms of technological strength. So we've taken these de-risking measures. Now, they're a small part of the overall trade. When Secretary Gina Raimondo was here just over a year ago, she said she thought it was about 1% of U.S. China trade was subject to these export controls by the U.S. But it's a very important thing that we're doing. And, she and I both believe that our national security is non-negotiable here. We're not going to make any excuses. We're taking the right steps in shutting down some of these American tech exports and placing limits on American private sector investments, say, into the AI industry in China. It is not in our interest to do that. And so we're prohibiting it. So that's the balance, the tricky balance between a normal economic relationship and one that has to be restricted from a national security perspective. I'd say one more thing. I have heard from a lot of companies, friends, journalists, why aren't you allowing low-priced Chinese electric vehicles in the American market or solar panels? Because that would help us on climate change. Well, the answer to that is, first of all, we cannot just ignore blatantly unfair economic, highly subsidized dumping by the government of China. We just have to protect our industries. But we learned a signal lesson during the pandemic. No country should want to be entirely dependent on a single source of supply of a critical mineral or a critical technology. We need to build up our own ability to manufacture solar panels and electric vehicles. And you look at the progress that Tesla and some of the other auto manufacturers have made there, and certainly on critical materials, and certainly when it comes to lithium batteries. And so what President Biden has done in the Infrastructure Act of 2021, but particularly in the CHIPS and Science Act and in the Inflation Reduction Act, we are, in terms of industrial policy, we're trying to help American manufacturers in the green economy to establish themselves, and we're protecting them from grossly unfair competition from Chinese producers. And so we're doing what's right for America and for our national security interests. We're convinced of that. And that's how I'd answer your very good question.
Well, and mentioning national security interests, let me turn the discussion a little bit here to sort of political military area. As you say, that's also a very, very active area of competition. I guess there's sort of three main areas, the Indo-Pacific and sort of the Russia, Ukraine, Iran, North Korea nexus, and then third, Taiwan. So maybe if we can just briefly touch on those. We have a question that has come in saying, why is China so desperately trying to assert its power in Asia? So could you talk a little bit about what China has been doing in the East and South China Seas and how we are responding to that? And also, I'm going to weave into this too, focus a little bit more also on just how our alliances, our allies and partners are helping us in this and in the economic area as well, as you already pointed out. So first, sort of East Asia area.
These are all important issues to discuss. We could probably
yes.
probably put together courses at the University of Montana on each of them.
We will.
Over 3 or 4 months in a semester. Well, I'd say this, we're seeing a dramatic push for power by the People's Republic of China in the Indo-Pacific. Lee Kuan Yew, the great leader of Singapore before he died, said that he felt that it was China's ambition to become the dominant military power in the Indo-Pacific. Well, the United States is a Pacific country, and we've had treaty alliances since just after the Second World War, 75 years now, 80 years with some of these countries out here, and we're not going to go away. And so I think what's happened here, I think the leadership here in Beijing has been surprised by the degree to which we've strengthened our treaty alliances with Japan, with the Republic of Korea. We've seen an historic coming together of Korea and Republic of Korea and Japan, with the Philippines, with Thailand, with Australia. Why is that? Because we are all democracies and we all want to live in peace. But we know we have to strengthen our treaty alliances so that China doesn't think it has an open field or open seas here to act in an incredibly aggressive way, as it's been doing towards some of these neighbors in the Spratlys and Paracels of the South China Sea, Senkaku's East China Sea, Taiwan Strait. That's the arena of competition. And we're just acting in a rational way to build up these alliances. And I actually think it's one of the most important achievements of President Biden is to have strengthened these alliances. So that's point one. On Russia, we have a significant open disagreement with what China is doing. China is protecting Russia at the Security Council. China is in Russia's camp politically and diplomatically. Even more importantly, we have charged, and we are absolutely sure of our facts, that hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese companies have been providing dual-use technologies to the Russian defense industrial base that has allowed Russia to continue this war, to bomb Ukrainian civilians, to, in this vicious war that it brought upon the people of Ukraine to act as illegally as Putin is acting. And to see China in its no limits partnership supporting Russia has produced a significant disagreement between us and the Europeans. We now see Europe, in both the EU, the European Union, and NATO, calling China a systemic rival, in large part because China is trying to tip the balance of power against Europe by supporting Vladimir Putin in the war in Ukraine. I give you another example. In the Middle East, China has not used its influence as we had hoped it would to try to stem the Houthi rebels shutting down trafficking in the Red Sea, firing missiles against container traffic, one of the most important supply chains in the world. We've not seen China use its influence either to convince Hamas to agree to a ceasefire, or Hezbollah to restrain itself, or to Iran, its major trading partner, to restrain itself. So we have a number of disagreements, and I'm being open here. And by the way, Chinese officials are as open in criticizing the United States, and they do this routinely, in writing and in person, as I'm doing today. This is part of the competitive relationship between us. So I think in those three areas, the Indo-Pacific, Russia, Ukraine, and in the Middle East, we still have substantial differences of policy with the government of China.
And here, then, let's turn to Taiwan. Some of the questions that have come in express some concern about the risk of conflict. You've already said we're trying very, very hard to avoid conflict. I think it's pretty clear that the Taiwan situation is a bit of a tinderbox here. China has said it wants to be able to take over Taiwan, or Xi Jinping has told the People's Liberation Army to be ready to take it over by 2027. Can you just talk about the importance of Taiwan to the United States and how the United States is working to try to avoid miscalculations either on the part of the Chinese or the Taiwanese that could end up dragging us into conflict?
Well, it's obviously one of the most important issues that we have here in all of Asia, but particularly with the People's Republic of China. What I can tell you, Joanna, is the obvious point. Our one China policy that every administration since the administration of President Nixon has adhered to, that has not changed. And President Biden has spoken many times about this, and very clearly. We subscribe to our one China policy. We stand behind it. We also subscribe to the Taiwan Relations Act that Congress passed in January 1979. That's the law of the land, and we abide by that, and by the three communiques that were passed by various administrations. And so that's the one China policy. It has stood the test of time. The Taiwan Strait has been largely peaceful all the way back to the 1950s, before the crisis of 1958, for instance, or the crisis of 1996. It's been a largely peaceful region, and we think it ought to stay that way. And so we don't support Taiwan independence, but we do support very strongly a peaceful resolution of the cross-strait differences. And we call upon the People's Republic of China to commit itself to a peaceful resolution of this long-running dispute. And that has not happened. China has not given up the right to use force. We think that's a great mistake. And if we would just, if they would just observe the status quo that goes back to the 1950s, of not having aircraft or naval vessels cross the median line in the Taiwan Strait, of committing to peace and to a peaceful dialogue across strait, we think that is the only way to go in this region. And we are supported in this, by the way, by the vast majority of countries around the world, including the vast majority of countries, particularly in this region, the Indo-Pacific. And it's been a bipartisan policy. I have served, as you said in the introduction, I started in the Carter administration as an intern, so I go back that far. We've had Republican and Democratic consensus on the one China policy in our own country, and that's the basis, and that is the core of President Biden's policy on this issue.
Well, thank you very much. And yeah, I think that we all hope that this can remain peaceful, not too fraught. It is good news to hear that there's now military to military cooperation, because, as you say, that seemed to have frozen there for a while.
That's critical.
And we need to talk. We need to be able to be in touch. There are more questions, but before I move to some of the other questions that have come in from our viewers, I'd like to just take a moment and ask you a personal question. We do have a lot of young people who are now watching or who will be watching this in their classrooms. You've now served as ambassador to China, Greece, NATO, but can you maybe tell us what, and just focusing on China, what have you found most rewarding about your service there, and what do you see as your biggest challenge and as ambassador?
Well, it's a question I've actually thought about a lot, my wife and I, as we live here. Certainly, I'm going to start with the challenge, but end with the better news. The biggest challenge is to conduct a relationship between our government and the government of the People's Republic that will be effective. And that means being tough-minded, hard-nosed about defending American interests in all those areas that we've just talked about where we are competing. And we have substantial differences, whether it's human rights or technology or trade and investment or the security issues out here in the Indo-Pacific. And these are sometimes very difficult conversations that we have to have. We always try to be civil and respectful, but we make no apologies about defending American interests. I think conducting a relationship like that, and this is about as difficult a relationship as we have with any country in the world. It takes a team. I'm really fortunate to have a great team in this embassy and in our consulates of young Americans and sometimes middle-aged Americans, then old people like myself. And the great majority of our officers speak Mandarin. The great majority of them have been here in the past, and a lot of them started as high school and college students. And that was my urging of the University of Montana students and other students, whether high school or college. Think about sometime in your life coming over here for a summer to learn Mandarin. Come for a year, your junior year in college. Come after and visit China and travel here after you graduate from college. This is the other big, great power in the world, and we Americans need to understand it. So in terms of challenge, I think that's the challenge. In terms of maybe on the positive side, Libby, my wife and I, and we've lived in 8 countries together. We met in Paris 48 years ago as 20-year-olds, and we've lived as a Foreign Service family with our kids all over the world. We've lived in West Africa, in Mauritania, in the Sahara Desert. I was in the Middle East, in Cairo and Jerusalem. I managed our aid program to the Palestinian people 40 years ago on the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We've lived in Europe. This is a fascinating country. The Chinese people are extraordinarily impressive, as I began with. They're hardworking, they're goal-oriented, very civil. I travel all around China, north, south, east, west, and the Chinese people unfailingly engaging, civil, friendly. There are a lot of links between our countries. We have 5 million Asian Americans in the United States. We have lots of Chinese Americans, particularly in California and New York, New Jersey. And, the bridges that they built are really important. So one of the things that Libby and I have reflected on, because we've lived all over the world, is we just think, even after we're nearing 3 years here, early in 2025, we're scratching the surface of understanding the incredible history and culture of this country. And so I'll give you an example. We went to Chengde last week during Golden Week here. This is the National Day, October 1st. Chengdu is a city, about 75 miles probably north of here. We went up on the high-speed train, which is an incredible experience in itself to travel by train here, and saw the summer residence of the Ming and Qing emperors, and learned a lot about Tibetan Buddhism because the emperor, several of the Qing emperors were Tibetan Buddhists, excuse me, and learned a lot about imperial history. And we'll be traveling out in Western China, not too far from now, to a region several thousand miles from here, which is completely different than the coastal cities of Eastern China. So it is an endlessly fascinating country filled with endlessly fascinating people. So that's been the positive side.
Well, that's great to hear. And I have to say, the times that I've traveled there, I've certainly not spent nearly as much time as you have. But yes, I've found people to be very welcoming, very open. And this leads me, well, I will say too, at the University of Montana, we are now teaching Mandarin, and we have now we plan to launch, Mansfield Center plans to launch student exchanges, sending students to China. So we may be in touch with you in the embassy as that unfolds, because we do want to build that. And that brings me to a question. A number of people have raised concerns about the decline in the people-to-people contacts. One person writes and says, that they have been writing to former friends and colleagues of theirs that in some cases are in ethnic areas, and they're getting no responses. And as you say, the number of American students going, but how do you see the prospects of increasing the people-to-people ties? And I'll just say we're maybe shorter answers. So I have a couple more questions, and we're getting towards the end of our hour here.
Okay. Well, first of all, I failed to mention that there's a Max Baucus Institute at the University of Montana. And and Max is a good friend and was a really, really fine ambassador here. We've had students from the University of Montana and Montana State visit us the last 2 summers. And it's been great to see them, undergraduate students as well as graduate students. I think, Joanna, we've got to avoid at all costs a decoupling of our two societies. The Chinese policy of zero COVID, the lockdowns, the quarantines during the pandemic really shut down, and just the pandemic in our own country shut down travel. So tourism's down, flights are down, the number of American students and business travelers down. And, we're going to compete with China, but we have to keep the two peoples of the two countries connected to each other. We don't want to go back in my youth. In your youth, you and I was young kids, grew up in the old Cold War, where we really didn't have much contact with the peoples of the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. We don't want to repeat that. So that's point one. And I think that's important, that we put in place a major effort to see our peoples connected. I'll give you an example that's positive. We've seen an increase in interest by Chinese students of visas to study in the United States. In 2023, we had about 292,000 Chinese students in the United States at our universities. That's the single largest foreign student group in our university campuses. And we had a very good summer here in Beijing of issuing student visas to Chinese students. And we want to see Chinese students continue to be at the University of Montana, Boston College, where I was an undergraduate, LSU, all over the United States. It's important.
And yeah, we would love to see more too, because that interchange is certainly very, very important. There are so many other areas. I guess one question that a number of people have asked questions, and I'll sort of lead us maybe to draw a close a little bit on this, but do you see any way for us to reduce the tensions, to de-escalate, or do you really think that we're at this point pretty well on a path that's just going to be a very difficult one to manage?
Well, first of all, we are not on an irreversible path to conflict, because we have human agency and human beings make these decisions. Presidents and in our country, members of the Senate and House, members of the State Department, and certainly the Chinese leadership. So number one, we've got to compete, but compete peacefully. Number two, I think we do have to assume that this is a structural rivalry, and it's going to be so for many years to come. And so we have to be prepared for that. And we are here. And we are competing here in a very tough-minded way. I do think we've been able to stabilize the relationship in a way since the last November's meeting between President Biden and President Xi. So we're talking military to military. We're doing more on fentanyl. We're beginning an AI conversation. We're still trading agriculture. And it's important to keep those avenues of communication open. I don't use the word trust. I wouldn't use that. I think the competition is so intense between us, there isn't trust. And so we've got diplomats to deal in that environment, to be tough-minded and to disagree when we have to disagree and defend our interests. It's not a question of trust. It's a question of being effective in making sure that we deter the worst aspects of China's aggressive policies in this region, but also have enough connectivity that we can manage crises when they occur. And then from time to time, when our interests are aligned, and I think they are on climate eventually, we can work together. So that's complexity. And when people talk to me sometimes and ask questions, they kind of want a black and white answer. And I usually say, this is a very complicated relationship. And we've got to think of it as a complicated relationship, which is why we have to have well-trained people. And I must say, in my team here, we've got great people in this embassy, career Foreign Service officers, 48 U.S. government agencies, and I'm very grateful to have this incredible team working with me.
Well, and I will just draw us to a close on that note, because I think it's very, very important to say that diplomacy and efforts to keep open the lines of communication with countries, whether they are our competitors or not, is a very important aspect of our national security. And so, you know, you and your team are doing a lot of work to try and keep this relationship peaceful. You have served a long time as a U.S. diplomat, so I thank you so much for your service. And I will say, when you were appointed ambassador, I was delighted, because given your background, I think I can hardly think of anybody who's better to serve in that your position right now, given the challenges of the relationship with China. So I want to thank you for being with us tonight. You know, it's just been very, very insightful. As you say, we could go on for hours on this issue, and there will be courses, I'm sure, at the University of Montana on these. And so thank you so much. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. And I just want to also invite you to our next dialogue, which will be October 29th at 7 p.m. with the Reverend Nelson Rivers. He will be both at the university, and it will be on live stream. He is going to be discussing the leadership principles of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and talk about how they can be applied today. So Ambassador Burns, thank you so much. Thank you for your service. And thank you all for being with us, and a good night to all.
Thank you, Joanna. Been a pleasure. Thank you.